punya, they do create merit, that is true. But are you saying they never pray for a job? They never pray for the health of their wife or husband or child? They never pray for promotion in a job?
In Sri Lanka, they do that largely at, they may pray to worldly kinds of gods at Hindu temples in Sri Lanka. But those are really, the Buddhist Sangha, the ordained monks and nuns, really kind of discourage and really kind of turn their heads to that sort of thing in Sri Lanka.
But when you say a Buddhist does not pray, then you're saying the Buddhist monk who is correctly oriented to Buddhist traditions does not pray. He or she meditates in this particular kind of way and aspires in this particular kind of way.
Right.
In that, of course, I would agree with you. I was drawing your attention to the fact that when you're outside the Sangha, when you're with ordinary people, then ordinary Buddhists do pray.
Yeah, I mean, sure, people do all sorts of things.
Okay.
I mean, we can talk about the kinds of things Christians do too.
Sure.
That may not be particularly Christian.
Yeah, sure. That's one of the reasons I'm not a Christian. So, I'm not saying I'm perfect, I'm just saying that's one of the reasons. But help me to understand, why is it that the Buddhist male monk has, if I remember correctly, something like 220 odd rules. The female monk has 300, nearly 100 more rules. Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them had to do with the cultural context. I mean, for instance, what I mentioned about prostitutes being the only women who traveled in India at that time, who went from town to town. One of the additional vows for Buddhist nuns that monks don't have is that Buddhist nuns are not allowed to shave their armpits. Why?
Because prostitutes did.
Because prostitutes did, so they wouldn't be mistaken as prostitutes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think a lot of it has to be taken in its context. And the Buddha himself put monastic vows in several different categories. Some that were like, these are always, can't change these. And these are maybe culturally contingent that don't necessarily need to remain forever.
But how do we know that he did that? We can't rely on the biography, we can't rely on... If the traditions have different authorities and different texts that they take as being authoritative, then how do we know what he really taught?
We don't know for sure, but we don't really know what Jesus taught either.
Oh, we
Why
do.
don't we use that as a question? Let's see if we can get one on Christianity. Could we use that as a segue to question Christianity just for a moment?
Sure. How do we know what Jesus taught?
Because in the case of Jesus, his biographies were written down within a few years of his death.
Well, the earliest was Mark, 30 years after his death.
30 years after his death, but not 500 years after his death.
But not by people who knew him directly, actually.
Oh yes, indeed, by people who knew him directly. So Luke talks about it. He says, Luke was not an eyewitness. Matthew claims to be an eyewitness. John claims to be an eyewitness. Mark claims to be an eyewitness. The only person who says very clearly that he was not an eyewitness is Luke. And Luke says very clearly he went and talked to eyewitnesses, compared accounts, and then wrote down his biography of Jesus.
Right, but if you just kind of take self-reference, I mean, historical Bible scholars will say that none of the Gospels were authored by people who knew Jesus. That they were written 30 to 70 years after his passing. And
Sure.
so, I mean, you could take the Bible at face value, and I could take the Buddhist sutras at face value, but that kind of leaves us in the same place.
It is not, because the Buddha sutras differ from each other depending on whether you're Mahayana, Vajrayana, or Theravada. Because the sutras are regarded as differently authoritative by the different traditions.
I would say that the different Buddhist traditions and scriptural sources, I would say Mahayana complements, I would say that they complement one another more than they differ. I don't think they differ. I mean, certainly there are differences. I wouldn't argue that there aren't. I mean, I'm a scholar of their differences.
Indeed, indeed, yes.
We have time for one more question among yourselves,
But I don't feel like they're...
Help me to understand how it is that such a quiescent, quiet, peaceful, positive religion, which obviously, I accept that Buddhism is, how is it that it has created in the last few decades the kind of violence that has broken out in Buddhist society? And this is Buddhist violence, it's not anti-Buddhist violence, is what I mean. It's not violence that is not sanctioned by the Sanghas. In Sri Lanka, for example, against the Tamils. In Thailand, for example, against the Muslims. I mean, just help me to understand why it's arisen and what's behind it.
I agree. I think it's a tragedy that it's happened. Bad PR for Buddhists.
No, I'm trying to get you to help me to understand why it's arisen. What is it in the Buddhist practices which is not eradicated after all these thousands of years, and a system which systematically instructs. People become monks for many years. Every male becomes a monk in Thailand or Sri Lanka for a certain number of years, and then if he or she wants, leaves the Sangha and becomes a layman, then can go back to being a monk. In spite of all this, what is
the vast majority of Buddhists are just ordinary human beings like everybody else. I mean, it's kind of like, what in Jesus' teachings inspired the Inquisition and the Crusades? I mean, nothing in what Jesus said inspired those kinds of things.
Yes.
So I don't think looking to where is it in Buddhism that would inspire, the Sinhalese to attack Tamils.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know if it's primarily ethnic violence as opposed to religious based. Those kinds of lines, it's all kind of gray and muddy.
Yes.
I'm
not a defender of the Inquisition, but I would put it to you that it's state power in the case of Christianity and the abuse of state power by people who claim to be Christians, obviously, claim to be inspired religious, leads to violence in the case of whether it's the Inquisition or whether it's what happened in Latin America, whether it's what happened in my own country, in Portugal, through the Portuguese in Goa and so on. This is the use of state power, and a follower of Jesus like me regards that when Christianity, the followers of Jesus, become mixed up with state power, that is a sure recipe for abandoning the teachings of Jesus, because Jesus was not about power. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. He could have taken up swords. He told his disciples not to. So there's an essential betrayal of the teachings of Jesus whenever the followers of Jesus get into positions of state power.
Right. Thank you, John.
In the case, can I just complete? In the case of Buddhism, in the case of Buddhism, the Buddha taught very clearly what kind of state power there should be and how it should be used.
Right. Human beings get to power and they abuse it. And,
of course.
But I think you can look at these kind of important examples which Buddhists around the world are disgusted by, what's happened in Burma recently and
of course.
Things like that.
Yes.
But I think you could also just as easily and probably more importantly, look at the example of the Dalai Lama. I mean, here's somebody who did have state power and who's firmly committed to nonviolence. Even in the face of an immense amount of violence, he's never once tried to get another country to come in and, help militarily or anything like that.
But that's not the tradition of the
Why don't we leave it at that, gentlemen? Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you so much. This is where you've been sitting very patiently, and you will now have an opportunity, if you would like, to ask questions of either of our speakers. So if you would like to ask a question of Professor Guptara, please line up on my right. And if you would like to ask a question of Dr. Blumenthal, please line up on my left.
And what happens if they want to address questions to both of us?
Then they'll be in whatever line they'll be in. Please, I request that you'll have your question ready as you stand in line, and that you will briefly recount that question to our microphone representatives, who will make sure that you can be concise. We ask that you will keep your questions short and to the point, and please additionally refrain from giving a statement of personal opinion, from arguing with either of our speakers, or from delivering a speech of your own. After all, we are here to hear these two distinguished gentlemen. Speakers, if you're asked a question, the other speaker will have the opportunity, if that person so wishes, to respond. And we ask that you'll limit your comments to, say, 2 minutes at most. Why don't we begin on this side, please?
So this question is for Dr. Guptara.
Correct.
I'm a Buddhist. I lived in Thailand for 12 years. That's where I grew up. And obviously I'm of male gender. I find it pretty interesting how you described in Thailand that I think the males there are fascinated with the penis, which I have no idea which part of the Thai culture you're talking about. So I would like you to sort of elaborate on your experience behind the remark.
There are very briefly two things. One is there is a penis park in the middle of Bangkok, and if you haven't visited it, I suggest you do. This is regularly visited and offerings are made to it. And this is directly connected with the sex trade in Thailand. And it is a matter of historical record that Buddhism and the sex trade have existed together, as you know very well, for thousands of years. And Bangkok is one of the centers of the sex trade. I'm not saying India isn't. I know that we have the sex trade in India as well. But that would be my brief answer to you.
Thank you.
Dr. Blumenthal, would you like to respond? All right. Next question, please.
This question is to both. In reading Thich Nhat Hanh, I came...
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh, in reading the author Thich Nhat Hanh, I came away with the conclusion that in Christianity there is this search to be at one with God. In Buddhism, there is this search for enlightenment. And I came away with the conclusion from his readings that these are not two separate things. And that when both get to the same place, we would probably have similar conclusions. And I wanted both of you to say whether you agree or disagree with this.
We'll begin with Dr. Blumenthal.
Sure. Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh is one of the great Buddhist masters of the 20th century and now 21st century. He's from Vietnam. I both agree and disagree. I mean, I think if you look at descriptions of nirvana, of the state of salvation from a Buddhist perspective, that it's this profound peace and happiness and state of well-being and whatnot. And then if you look at theological descriptions of heaven from a Christian perspective, it's this profound peace and well-being and happiness. I mean, granted, it's described as a result of being in proximity to God, but the emotional kind of, this description of the emotional state, of the kind of spiritual state of both kinds of beings is remarkably similar. So I agree in that way. I think there's a danger in kind of trying to make all religions sort of be exactly the same when in fact there are real differences. So while I appreciate and I can see some real important points that Thich Nhat Hanh is making, I think it's important to also at the same time be clear on the differences between religious traditions as well.
I agree with you, but I think what you were saying, sir, is that not that there are no differences, but that the differences, if they could be recognized for what they are and reconciled, then we would be in a better position than we are today. Is that the right understanding of what you were saying?
I wouldn't say that there are no differences.
No.
Fundamentally, there is not a difference. So that's what I would say.
Yes, I think we are agreed there are differences. My point of view would be that the psychological experience of peace that you get through meditative techniques, which, by the way, I practice, not all of them, of course, but I have practiced both Buddhist and Hindu meditative practices. You do get a feeling of peace through them. The question is whether this feeling of peace, which is a psychological experience, is enough in terms of transforming you morally or ethically. It can do, but sometimes that feeling of peace and so on need not result in moral transformation. But an encounter with God must by definition result in moral transformation. And the reason for that is because God has a moral character. And if you confront God, if you experience God, then it must result in a moral transformation of yourself, because as Jesus put it, it is by their fruit that you know them, not the feelings that they have, but by the actual fruit that they have that you know them. And the fruit that he was talking about was, of course, ethical transformation. And the reason why that is important is because the universe is built, if it's created by God, in a way that reflects God's character. And when you're transformed by God, then you start doing things in a way that lines up with the nature of the universe. So I'm for Buddhist meditative practice, I'm for Hindu meditative practice, I'm for yoga. All that I submit to you is that it does not result in your knowing God. And if you want to know God, then look at Jesus.
Please.
This question is for Dr. Guptara. You talked about how Christianity is a systematic portrayal of Jesus. And in light of that comment, could you define Christianity or your view of that? Maybe expand on that a little bit more.
Sure. I define Christianity as what happened from the 3rd century AD onwards, when followers of Jesus got into bed with state power. As a result of which, you had the phenomenon of the use of state power to impose Christianity on people who did not want necessarily to be Christians. There's a story that is told, not directly about this point, but related to it, which illustrates it. There was one of these tribes, this is obviously an apocryphal story, but there was one of these tribes that was Muslim. And at the orders of the emperor, they were marched through the river and declared to be Christians. Of course, when they got to the other side, they put down their prayer mats, they turned towards Mecca, and they started praying. And the general who just ordered them to be marched through the river turned to the Pope and said to him, "Sir, look, these stupid people still think they are Muslims." The point is that this kind of imposition of Christianity on tribes that didn't necessarily even understand what was happening to them at that time, since they were basically illiterate and ignorant, was nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus. If you look at the Pope who represents the majority tradition in Christianity, he is the head of a state. He has the right to raise an army. He hasn't done it recently, but he has the right to raise an army, and it's a right he's never renounced. What has that to do with the teachings of Jesus? The Church the Roman Catholic Church claims to be the true representative of Jesus Christ, but when you look at the way the vice-regent, the person who's supposed to represent Jesus, has behaved through the centuries in arrogating to himself power of various sorts, what has that to do with Jesus? So I'm picking, of course, at the moment on Roman Catholicism. I could pick on Protestant traditions, making very similar points, but I think I've spoken enough.